right, good day, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Today, we are looking at Assignment 2. So this is your NSS session for Assignment 2. Just before I start, I just want to address a couple of common challenges that I have seen and that I would like you to focus on in this assignment. The first one is the use of sources. Now, the way you really want to use your sources is you want to use them to support your own argument. So there are two ways to do this. The first is you provide your own argument and discussion, and then you use a source to prove or to support your argument. The second way is you use a source, so you paraphrase from a source, and then you unpack and explain that, that information. You show how it is relevant to the question. What we need to see is your own understanding, insight, and engagement. If you have a reference at the end of every sentence, that is a very strong indication to you that you are over-relying on resources. Because what you don't want your question to be is simply a collection of other people's ideas and work. That is incredibly difficult for us to mark because we can't see your own understanding and your own discussion. Now, the best way to approach questions that require sources is to read the question and then to write down all your own ideas first. So you write down whatever it is that you know on the topic before you research or before you look for anything else. Once you have your own ideas, then you can go and do some research, you can look some things up, you jot down, you paraphrase, and then you make notes on the information that you have gathered, your own insights, your own thoughts, what you understand. And this will elevate your mark incredibly. So please make sure that you are using sources to support your argument instead of forming your argument. The next challenge I have noticed is that English is a very creative subject. One of the fantastic things about teaching English is that we have so much scope to include really interesting, really creative, really enjoyable and engaging lessons and resources and activities. So what you really would need to focus on in this assignment is making sure that your presentations and your activities are really creative and engaging. So think about something that you would really enjoy doing in the classroom. If you were a student, what would you like? This is going to make an incredible difference in your assignment. And then when it comes to your assessments and presentations and handouts, you want to be careful with the level at which you are pitching these the information. So you want to make sure that it is academic, it is suitable for a grade 11 class, and that you cover everything. So you don't want it to be too basic, but you also want to make sure that you are pitching the vocabulary and the questioning at a level that your students are going to understand. So you do have to remember the case study where you are teaching, and you do have to consider, will the students be able to understand what I am saying? Will they know these words? So you want to find the middle ground, very much so. Don't want it too basic, but you don't want it too complicated. So those are the three areas where I would really like you to focus when you are doing this assignment. So the first question starts with a quote. Now, your answers are going to have to relate to this quote. It is true to say that poetry is a defunct genre in most South African English second language classrooms. This was certainly true of the school in which our case study is situated, Lamula Jubilee High School, Soweto, where the teaching of poetry was dropped in 1996 since it was too difficult for students. Outside of the South African context, and even within the context of English home language instructions, it appears that condensed, dense, and sometimes complex genre has lost its position of prominence in English classrooms, as testified by many writers on English in education. Okay, so where we are going with this is obviously we as English teachers do not want poetry to be dropped. We don't want it to be seen as something that learners cannot relate to. So where we are focusing here is on how to teach poetry in a way that is going to allow learners access to it. So we are looking specifically at multimodality. In reference to the excerpt above, discuss multimodality and its relevance in teaching poetry in a grade 11 poetry diverse classroom. So what we really want to look at is, first of all, we are looking at multimodality. So that's the first part of your discussion is, what is multimodality? Please remember, you have to provide your own understanding. So make notes on what you understand about multimodality before you look at any sources. Then, once you have looked at multimodality in general, you need to look at its relevance in teaching poetry. So why would it be important to use different modes in order to teach poetry? So you want to look at the requirements of teaching poetry. What is your aim in a poetry lesson, and how can you use different modes to achieve those aims? And then you are looking specifically at a grade 11 poetry diverse classroom. So we're looking at diversity, and particularly diversity in the engagement with poetry. So you need to explain multimodality, explain its relevance in teaching poetry, and its relevance in teaching poetry in a diverse classroom. So let's look at the rubric. The first thing we're going to look at is your understanding of multimodality. So it demonstrates a sophisticated and nuanced understanding of multimodality. So your good section is you've demonstrated a clear and accurate understanding of multimodality. That's great. So you've explained what it is. When you want to elevate that, you want to show a nuanced view of it. So you want to really analyze the use of multimodality in the classroom. Now, demonstrates limited or inaccurate understanding of multimodality. That is what happens when you only provide source material and no insight of your own, because that tells me that, well, it doesn't tell me, but I have to assume that perhaps you don't understand multimodality because you haven't shown me any evidence of your understanding. Okay. Application of teaching to poetry. We want to look at insightfully applies multimodality to enhance poetry teaching. So your good section is appropriately applies multimodality to teaching poetry. So that's okay, good. Yeah, I can see where you're going. It applies, it all work. To elevate it to great, you need to really show me how this is going to really improve your teaching of poetry. And I really want you to be very, very specific in your examples. So don't just say you can use visuals. to teach. Okay, but visuals is a very, very broad statement. What sort of visuals? How would I use visuals? So you want to use examples where it's as if the teacher in the classroom next door to you has used this in teaching poetry, and you are now telling me what this teacher did and why it worked. Okay. Then consideration of classroom diversity. So you explain the relevance to a diverse grade 11 classroom, thoughtfully links multimodality to diverse learning needs and contexts. So this one is where you really want to show how multimodality will help with teaching in a diverse classroom. Okay, and I have faith that you can all do that. Then, use of sources. Integrate sources carefully and fluently into the discussion. Now, what that means is that you use sources to support your argument. So I need to see that you are using references thoughtfully, so you know how to use a reference. Okay, so for question 1.2, we are talking about the same context. Outline 5 multimodal strategies that could help you to as a teacher to make poetry enjoyable and applicable in diverse settings. In your response, take into consideration the learning preferences of different learners in your FET classroom. So, remember, the multimodality looks at the different modes in which you deliver the content. So I need specific strategies. So not, once again, not just I will use visuals. Okay, are you going to use a movie, a picture? Are you going to print it? Are you going to do a slideshow? Are you going to, you know, bring in someone to stand as a living piece of art? What do you mean by I'm going to use visuals? Also, what you want to look at is enjoyable, so it must be fun, and applicable in diverse settings. So sometimes you are going to be at schools where multimodality is very easy to use, but I also need to see that you have considered how you can use multimodality in different schools and in different classrooms. So part of that is what is available to you in the classroom, and part of that is looking at, even in the same school, the different classes. So some classes are going to be very different to other classes. So we're looking at multimodal ways in which you can apply these different strategies to different classes. Okay, and finally, you really want to take into account learner preferences. So you must discuss learner preferences. So just to reiterate, 5 multimodal strategies. Then you are looking at making poetry. Also, very important. We're not talking in general, we're talking about poetry, enjoyable and applicable in diverse settings. And then you need to take into account learner preferences. Okay, so those are all the different areas you need to cover. And if we look at our marking criteria, so strategies are highly appropriate and creatively selected. So that elevates it from just they are appropriate. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for they are appropriate. To elevate your answer to great, I need to see they are highly appropriate. So you've really, really considered what's going to work the best, and they are creative. Okay, so you haven't just gone with the generics, which are fine, but you've really considered these things. And then strategies are thoughtfully adapted to diverse learner needs. So you've considered and you've explained how you can adapt these strategies and use these strategies to teach poetry to diverse learners. And then strategies are highly practical and adaptable to varied contexts. So what you are looking for is strategies that you can adapt. So if you're going to say, and it's not the most creative, but you're going to do a PowerPoint. Okay, but what happens if you are in a school that doesn't have projectors? Now, I'm not saying you can't use a PowerPoint, but how would you adapt that? So you really want to think about the practicalities of this and how you can fit these things to different situations. And then strategies strongly promote enjoyment and meaningful engagement. So it has to be learner-centered. You really want these strategies to get the learners involved in the lesson. No passive learning, no teacher-centered learning, actual active participation. And you want it to be enjoyable. So you really want them to engage with it and have fun. If it's boring to you, it's going to be boring to them. And then what you really want to do with your clarity and coherence, ideas are presented with clarity, confidence, and academic fluency. So you really want to take some time editing your work, making sure everything is very clear, making sure you have explained your ideas fully, and making sure that you have been very, very specific. And once again, I'm sure you will use resources. That's absolutely fine. However, you need to show that you can take the ideas presented in these resources and credit the resources. Obviously, you have to reference, but you have to show me that you can apply these ideas to the particular situation that you've been given, which is, of course, teaching poetry in a way that is enjoyable and applicable in diverse settings and taking into account learner preference. Okay, and you're teaching poetry. So that is question number 1.